This week on the Esther Krakue Show.
I wondered how on earth you managed to spend 60 quid, so you basically pay more per gram without ever being told, taking the piss. In moments of crisis, some companies discover how much they can raise prices before consumers push back. They've learned that you will actually absorb it. Your food bill feels like a tax because functionally it behaves like one. Food inflation is not a temporary glitch. So what can you do? Walked out of the supermarket with just a few basics and wondered how on earth you managed to spend 60 quid, or if you're in the US, $80. You look down at the bag and it's just eggs, bread, milk, maybe some chicken, coffee, and not much else. And somehow it still feels like daylight robbery. And no, you're not imagining it. In the US, egg prices have been getting hammered again by avian flu, and official forecasts were pointing to a very large rise in 2025. Coffee has been doing its own version of the same thing, with global prices surging sharply through 2024 and into 2025 as supply tightened and weather disruptions hit major producers like Brazil. In Britain, the bigger picture is that food and drink prices rose far faster than the overall CPI through the worst of the cost of living surge, and even when inflation comes down, you rarely feel it in your weekly shop. And even when prices don't rise on paper, you're often still being charged more in practice. Your crisp packets feel half empty, cereal boxes look suspiciously slimmer, and jars quietly shrink while prices stay smugly the same. Economists call it shrinkflation, meaning the pack size gets smaller without a matching drop in price, so you basically pay more per gram without ever being told. If you want the non-academic translation, it's simply put, taking the piss. It's tempting to blame greedy supermarkets or point vaguely at the war in Ukraine and move on, but the truth is more complicated and far less comforting. Rising food bills are being driven by a mixture of global supply shocks, energy costs, climate, geopolitics, and yes, plenty of corporate opportunism laid on top. The most important thing to understand is that when these forces push prices up, they rarely reverse in a way that feels meaningful. Prices tend to settle at a new, higher baseline, which is where every visit to Tesco or Walmart feels heavier on the wallet than the last one. That's the bad news. The good news is that once you actually understand what's happening, you can adapt in ways that genuinely help. You can't control global markets, but you can reduce how exposed you are to their worst effects. By the end of this, you'll understand what's driving your food bill and how to respond in a way that protects your household without turning your life into a spreadsheet. Food inflation is not random. It follows pressure points, and if you miss those, you end up blaming the wrong people or assuming nothing can be done. The first pressure point is energy. Food is, at its core, energy that's been converted into something edible, and the modern food system runs on fuel and electricity. You need energy to make fertilizer, to run farm machinery, to process crops, to refrigerate food, and to ship it across countries and oceans. Fertilizer is the cleanest example because it's basically energy on a label. Fertilizer prices surged around the start of the Ukraine war, partly because key producers and exporters were caught up in sanctions, disruptions, and knock-on costs, and that hit farms directly. When inputs become unaffordable, farmers cut back, plant less, or switch crops, and you get smaller harvests feeding into higher prices later on. Higher fuel prices then cascade through the rest of the system. They raise the cost of tractors, lorries, cargo ships, cold storage, and even supermarket lighting. You rarely see those line items individually, but you absolutely see the final number at the till. The second pressure point is climate. Weather has always mattered for food, but what has changed is the frequency and the intensity of the disruption. When drought scorches key growing regions, when floods wipe out crops, or when heat waves hit yields, supply tightens and prices spike. Coffee is a good example because it's extremely sensitive to weather and has been caught in repeated disruptions, which feeds directly into global prices. At the global level, the UN's FAO Food Price Index gives you a really useful reality check. Prices can fall month to month, but the overall environment remains more volatile than people expect, and the calm often just means prices are settling at a higher level rather than returning to what felt normal 5 years ago. Once you accept that climate disruption is no longer occasional, you stop thinking of food inflation as a weird blip and start treating it like a recurring stress test. The pandemic made visible something economists had known for years. Global supply chains are efficient, but they're fragile. If you build a system for maximum efficiency with no slack, then one disruption can ripple through everything. Sometimes it's labor shortages, strikes, or factory shutdowns. Sometimes it's logistics. The Panama Canal is a perfect example. Drought conditions forced restrictions on transits, which created delays and rerouting that pushes costs along the chain. And the choke points matter because so much trade funnels through them. Around 12% of global trade passes through the Suez Canal, which is why a blockage there can punch far above its weight. When one link breaks, prices spike elsewhere, and even after the immediate drama passes, the system tends to price in risk. In other words, you get a new normal. The fourth pressure point is corporate behavior. Not every price rise is unavoidable, and not every increase is purely driven by costs. In moments of crisis, some companies discover how much they can raise prices before consumers push back, and once that line moves, it rarely snaps back. The IMF has explicitly pointed to the role of higher profit margins in explaining a large share of recent inflation in Europe, which is the polite institutional way of saying that some businesses raise prices beyond cost increases. In the US, the Federal Trade Commission's grocery supply chain report found that large, dominant firms accelerated and distorted negative effects associated with disruptions, which again is a very careful way of describing opportunistic behavior in a messy moment. This is why when eggs or milk surge during a shock, retailers and suppliers rarely rush to bring prices back down the moment conditions improve. They've learned that you will actually absorb it. The fifth pressure point is currency and geopolitics. In Britain, the Brexit shock mattered because a weaker pound and higher trade frictions made imported food more expensive, and researchers estimated Brexit accounted for a meaningful share of the rise in food bills since 2019. Globally, export restrictions can move prices very, very fast. India's restriction on certain rice exports, for example, were followed by a sharp rise in benchmark international prices because the world's biggest exporter pulling back supply created an instant scramble. And on grains, the Ukraine war mattered because Russia and Ukraine were a huge part of global wheat exports on your receipt. And here's the uncomfortable reality. Food inflation is not a temporary glitch. It's a structural feature of a brittle global system. And even when official inflation falls, your weekly shop doesn't suddenly become cheap again. If you want the simplest way to remember it, it's this. Food is global. Crises create prices that stick. Supply chains remain delicate, and the pressure lands hardest on ordinary households who earn too much to qualify for support, but too little to absorb constant increases. Your food bill feels like a tax because functionally it behaves like one. It's built into the structure of the entire system. So what can you do, in practice, without turning your life into a joyless austerity experiment? First, focus on insulation. When staple foods drop in price, buying long-life items in bulk is not hoarding. It's protecting yourself from the next spike. It's the household version of risk management, and it actually works. The second is to get more comfortable with substitution. Flexibility matters more than loyalty to specific ingredients. If chicken becomes more expensive, switch proteins. If fresh produce spikes, use frozen. If a brand quietly shrinks its pack size, stop rewarding it. Rigid habits cost money, and the system is currently punishing rigidity. The third is to diversify where you shop. Prices vary far more than people realize between supermarkets, wholesalers, small grocers, discount chains, and local markets. Even rotating one or two categories to cheaper sources can meaningfully cut your average bill. The steepest part of food inflation is concentrated in ultra-processed and convenience foods because you're paying for packaging, branding, labor, and margin. Cooking from scratch doesn't have to mean sourdough and homemade yogurt. It can be as simple as learning 5 reliable meals that are cheap, filling, and flexible. Finally, treat community like an economic tool, not just a vibe. Sharing bulk purchases, swapping surplus food, and shopping collectively spreads costs in ways individual households simply can't. The modern economy tries to make everyone operate as a lone consumer, but you don't have to play along. In short, your food bill is not rising because of one villain. It's rising because the system that feeds modern societies is brittle, exposed to shocks, and perfectly designed for costs to stick once they rise. You're not powerless inside that system, but you have to be deliberate.